Annie, can I get a refill? You have a unicorn horn.
Don't ask.
Can I have one? Please?
You'd be welcome to this one if I knew how it worked.
The unicorn took a sudden vacation, but he wanted to ensure the portals stayed working.
Oh yeah, that beach house in Seychelles. I told him not to go into that timeshare.
He's not one for listening. I don't know how to use this thing.
Does that horn come with user manual, perhaps?
I wish. He only said it would last until he returns from vacation, and I'd figure it out. I tore 3 shirts today just trying to get dressed.
This season of the Bug Hunters Cafe is made possible by Terrific, Mousepom Media, and Manning Publications.
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I was looking at this flyer for a timeshare. What'd you say?
Oh, nothing.
Sorry!
She's been knocking over everything today with that unicorn horn.
There's gotta be a better way to keep the portals running.
I'm sure. But you know unicorn. Instant gratification.
Yeah, that's him. Well, maybe Tomasz Lelek needs to talk to him about trade-offs. That's who we're having coffee with. He's a staff software engineer at Dremio and a technical trainer at Bottega IT Minds. He also co-authored the book, Software Mistakes and Trade-Offs, with John Skeet.
I wish I could do a trade-off with Annie. I want a unicorn horn.
It might be more trouble than it's worth. Oh, hey, Tomasz, pull up a chair.
Hi. Welcome. Oh,
Hey, it's good to see you.
What are you going to have for drink? I always bother Jason to get me something amazing.
Well, you always get the same thing. It's the double shot espresso without any coffee. Still don't know how they make that.
With the rainbow sparkles.
With the rainbow sparkles. Can I get you anything to drink, Tomasz?
maybe just a Coke.
Okay. I can definitely do that. Would you like classic Coke, or would you like we pulled it out of the year it was invented Coke?
Yeah, it's classic for sure.
All right. I'll go grab that for you.
So, Tomasz, tell me about trade-offs. What was the biggest trade-off of your life?
Is it about engineering or in general?
Your choice.
I mean, I think the place where you live is the most important trade-off. I mean, if you live closer to your family, then of course you are closer, you can meet with them more often, but on the other hand, you may lack some opportunities, right? Or maybe the climate is not so good. So I think that's the biggest trade-off. I mean, I'm living in Poland. So for example, right now, maybe in a month or so, the weather will start getting really bad. But, I could go to Spain or somewhere else, but my family, I wouldn't be able to see them. Right? So that's the biggest trade-off for me.
It's a really good answer. I think it's same for me. I think you found the universal trade-off.
Maybe the unicorn should have thought about that before he got that timeshare in the Seychelles. Here's your drink, Tomasz, and here's your usual Bojan.
Thank you.
So, what led you to write a book about trade-offs in software?
I mean, since the beginning of my career, I was passionate about software. It's not like I only did that 9 to 5 job, but I've tried to read a lot, learn a lot, and observe a lot of things. And see, I think after 2 years, I've started noticing some patterns, decisions that each team need to make, and it's also regarding code at a really low level, like which pattern to choose, but also at the higher level, like architecture. Do you want to go into microservices or this small application that works good in your context? So I've started noticing those problems and discussions. And I've started having a personal Google Doc basically with all those most important decisions. And then I was able to get back to it, after half a year, 1 year or something like this, and try to learn on sometimes mistakes, right? Sometimes good decisions. But yeah. And also what was important is that I didn't, jump from one company to another, like every year or so. But I've stayed like 4 years. Like even for the Allegro group that I was working, it was like around 4 years. Data Stacks also around 4 years. So I was able to see how the system evolved and performed in the after years. So during the runtime, from this perspective. So that was the initial spark for this book.
So it sounds like it's difficult to understand the implications of trade-offs if your involvement in the project is very short term.
Yes, I think that's a correct statement. Yeah, because if you are short term, maybe you want to, you have a conflict of interests. Maybe you want to learn new technology and maybe just use it in this specific project because I will learn that. But you will not maintain that. So there is no this phase of looking at the system later, only at the beginning when you can, experiment, use some new great technology. This specific aspect, I've covered that in the last chapter of my book. So it's like about keeping up to date with trends versus cost of maintenance of your code. And so those technologies like reactive programming or, some new framework like Spring Framework in Java ecosystem and so on. So sometimes it's not good in your context and how to decide if it is or not.
I had a very good discussion about that with the client around the time when Electron was getting popular. And they wanted to migrate their Android app fully to Electron. And I was like, let's wait a year or two to see if it gets traction and support and everything. And client was, but maybe it won't exist in 2 years. We should do it now. And I'm like, do you really want to invest time into something that may not exist in 2 years?
That's a good point.
Yeah, clients also love shiny new things, especially if they are blockchain and AI related.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen a fair bit of that in my specialty is in legacy code. So I'm a consultant and I help modernize. And sometimes I'm seeing consequences of that shiny object kind of mentality from previously, and it resulting in using a library which was, really popular and trendy at the time, but then which just didn't deliver on its promises. But then, I've certainly seen the other side of it too, where, I was looking at one project where the logging was literally import logging. It was, the Python built-in logging library, which is a good library for logging, but not for certain situations. And suffice to say, this is one of those situations where it was definitely they were having to manually work around some of the wrinkles, and where maybe doing some research into logging libraries would have been beneficial in that case. So I've definitely seen both sides.
Yeah, same applies for immutability. I'm also covering that. Immutability is a great concept, but we also need to have some kind of a native support in language, let's say. There are some trade-offs around that because you will have more memory pressure, right? More usage of memory. And if you have immutability built at top of the language or runtime that doesn't provide that out of the box. That's a difference, for example, between Scala language and Java. In Scala, those immutability structures are like first-class citizens. And on the other hand, in Java, they are like crafted after the language developed its own. So sometimes it's dangerous even, right, to use from the perspective of memory consumption. And similar, it's regarding recursion and the pattern of using recursion, recursive programming. So in Java, sometimes you may be really hit by problems with memory and so on. And if you have language that is also first like functional language from the beginning, it's easier.
Yeah. Or everyone's favorite object-oriented programming pattern, the singleton. Which it's funny because I have yet to actually encounter, they're out there, but I've yet to encounter in the wild a situation where the singleton should have been used. But I think a lot of times it's someone who's eager to have said that they've used every one of the patterns that they learned in their design patterns class, because I've seen some singletons that I've just kind of blinked, or especially in Python, just kind of blinked, rubbed my eyes and gone, this would be a module level variable. Why are you doing this to yourself?
Yeah, I don't think I ever used the singleton in Python, but in Java I used singleton for connection pools.
Yeah, that would make sense. And of course, Java doesn't play well with globals as well. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is one of those other trade-offs. Do you use a global variable or module level variable? Do you use a static class?
Yeah, the singleton problem or overuse. As you mentioned, I even also I have it in the first chapter of my book. So in the introduction, I'm trying to see the most overused or patterns that are not well understood, and singleton is there for the same arguments that you are right now mentioning. I mean, in Java, singletons are used more often. For example, in frameworks like Spring or Quarkus for some business logic units, right? Some service that is doing business logic and it's injected into DI. Only one instance of this, right? So that's, I mean, in Java, singletons are used very often. So, and maybe also overused as well.
So would you say that the failure to grasp some of these trade-offs can actually lead to bugs?
Yes, I mean, because right now we are speaking at the low level, right? Code level. I mean, this is only like a subset of my book. I mean, 3 or 4 chapters are regarding bugs. But of course, I mean, for example, this chapter that John wrote, this is chapter 7 about datetime. I mean, using datetime, I think leads to a lot of bugs, right? In production code. Maybe it's the top one place for bugs, right? Reason for bugs using datetime API and all the differences. I mean, each language has its own specific handling. Sometimes, with time zones and so on. So overusing or misusing datetime APIs is like, it can lead to really big bugs, right? That are hard to catch, or maybe occurs once a year, right? Once a century even, and maybe you have a bad luck and you will have that. So for sure, that's the one place.
One of my favorites in Linux for years and years, it was kind of a few years ago, the printer driver bug that literally only manifests on Tuesdays. And that was on account of the formatting of the timestamp and an error that was related to Tuesday as as data. So I still love that because it's, that's a won't fix.
We are only in the context of planet Earth, right? I mean, John is going into the details like what would happen if it will be, multi-planetary civilization, and we have some, hubs on Mars and on Earth, and what will happen with data APIs. So that's nice. If you are interested in something like this, I would recommend that this specific chapter.
Man, that's a terrifying thought. I had never thought of that before. If we ever managed to have a presence on other planets, human presence on other planetary bodies, what assumptions have we made in our code that are going to start manifesting as bugs? Oh, that's terrible.
I'm going to assume that you're going to need a PhD to do anything related to time zones in that case.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. So I imagine, though, that some other of these trade-offs could lead to bugs if it affected the design. Because, I mean, it looks like a lot of this affects the design. Like you mentioned, balancing flexibility and complexity. That going the wrong direction, the design can, I guess the better way to put it is unnecessarily create a risk of bugs for yourself. You're creating places for bugs to hide where you didn't ever need to create places for bugs to hide. So would you say that these design considerations could lead someone down a path that could give them more trouble than it's worth?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I think you are referring to chapter 2 when I'm speaking about duplication of code. And, on the universities, all students are learned that duplicating code is bad, right, in all the contexts. But that was like when we had my monolith application. where all the code resides in the same place and so on. And then we were migrating to this microservices world, where each service should be independent. But on the other hand, we are trying to extract everything and make it in the libraries and so on. And by that, coupling microservices with each other. And also sometimes the code that seems to be the same at the level when microservices are designed, microservices within different business domains will evolve in a way that it's not the same. But if you have the library, you will have the coupling, and it's hard to remove that coupling. So also, of course, as you mentioned, it may increase some probability for bugs if you will go to the other direction, like more duplications and so on. So it needs to be like in the middle.
Strangely, I've seen some bugs that resulted in lack of duplication because code that's so dry, it's arid, is a line I've used in a couple of blog posts, because like I made the mistake of reading the source code for GCC, which is interesting if you want to see the difference between the two major C++ compilers in the open source space, which are GCC and LLVM Clang. The source code alone just underscores how radically different the two are, because LLVM is for the most part, is very maintainable. It's clean. It's well structured. GCC is a lot of things, but I would definitely say it's very dry, to the degree that to follow a stack trace, you're going through about 50 or 60 files, because it is so broken up into macros and subroutines and functions calling other functions, which call other functions. I think it was by the time I hit the macros, I started crying, because it's so spread out.
Everything is implicit, and yeah. Well, I mean, in JVM world, we know that from Spring, and I mean that's one of the biggest problems in Spring, that everything is implicit, and without the knowledge within this system, it's hard to reason about. But also, there is another aspect of it that maybe that's why that you are mentioning, this project went into that direction. Maybe that's the performance, right? I mean, so if you need to optimize the code for the performance sensitive stuff, sometimes the code will become less readable. I mean that's in the Java, for example, if you want to have some memory alignment or something like this. So that's also my chapter 5. So it's about optimizing hot path, and also finding the paths in your code that deserve those optimizations. And on the other hand, if you will find that, you will need to sacrifice something. And sometimes it's the readability of the code, and therefore maybe also the probability for bugs may increase. But you have some real benefit out of it. I mean, the benefit is the performance in that case. Performance, throughput, or low latency.
And I imagine performance is probably one of the major goals. The irony is that GCC's performance is not as good as Clang, which doesn't do this. So, part of it is precedence too. GCC was written a lot earlier on. So there's just some technique, even though it's the same language, even the same, not really even using, and I mean, it's C. It's not like C changes that often. So given, you can compare versions of GCC and claim they're written the same version of C. But what's funny to me is that it kind of crossed that threshold of becoming overly dry to where it actually started, instead of positively impacting performance, it got on the other side of that parabolic arc and started negatively impacting performance. Because of course, then you have things like you have your instruction cast mishes and your.
So you need to handle every case, right? In this code. I mean, you need to make it so generic that the performance is lost. I imagine at some point.
Yeah.
If you have too many branches, right? For example, branch prediction. You have this on CPU, right? That CPU can guess and learn which branch will be executed in the future. So if you have so complex code complexity, like ifs, then CPU will not be able to use branch prediction. Is not able to use code cache like L1, L2, and so on. So yeah, I think it's.
It really is interesting how many optimization strategies wind up being de-optimization strategies when they're used inappropriately. They're scalpels rather than baseball bats.
And also it's regarding performance. Sometimes I saw this pattern or anti-pattern that you are focusing on the wrong places in your code. I mean, I'm mentioning in this chapter the Pareto principle. I think it's applying to computer science very well. That like a small part of your code is providing most of the value, business value, and so on. And the majority of the code is providing less business value. It's not so critical. And if you will try and will be able to detect those smaller parts and focus only on this area, your optimizations, then you will have really overall increase in performance. I mean, I'm trying to focus on that and calling that hot path. That was important when I was working at data stacks, and I was working at the Java driver for Cassandra. So that's my entry point for all JVM words if you want to connect to Cassandra database. So we had this distinction of this is a hot path in our driver, and we can sacrifice some of code readability and so on. But we know that every improvement in this area will give really significant benefits to the overall bad performance or maybe overall reduction of resources and so on. And other parts of the code that were not so critical, let's say, were able to maybe use some pattern that makes the code more readable and maintainable and so on.
I've been looking through our books, and I think I found something that might help.
You and your horn, a reference guide. I think this is about the musical instrument, Jess.
Oh, the unicorn is always reading it, so I thought it might have been about magic.
It was worth a try. I wonder if Manning Publications has anything on the topic. We can still get 35% off any order from Manning Publications with the coupon code PODBUGHUNT21.
Maybe there is something in the 106 volumes of documentation for the cafe.
I have a question for you. What's your favorite book?
Fictional or not?
I'm gonna let you choose.
Okay. That's hard. I mean, I try to read a lot. I use this Goodreads app to create a challenge to motivate me as well. So right now, this year, I think I have a challenge for 40 books. So maybe I will pick the Homo sapiens book from Harari. This is about the history of mankind, right, from the beginning to the start of civilization. I mean, he has three books: Homo sapiens, Homo Deus, is about the future or potential future of humans, and third one is some lessons for 21st century. So his predictions about the future. I mean, each of those books is great, I think. So depending if you are interested more what happened before Homo sapiens, what are the predictions, or where the human civilization can go. It's Homo Deus. And if you want to have a list of those things, then 21 lessons for 21st century.
The thing I love about human history is how everything repeats itself. We went from banging on rocks to banging on shiny rocks to banging shiny rocks into different shapes to teaching shiny rocks how to do math. And we haven't really upgraded our tools that far.
Yeah, I mean, this Homo sapiens is not so strict about some specific period of time, right? About period of time. Right now I'm reading the history of why the Roman Empire fallen, and that's what you're saying. I mean, they were constantly fighting inside of the country, but still managed to hold for so many years, like centuries. But it was repeating even in periods every Caesar was the same as the one before.
Speaking of infighting, sometimes in projects, we were talking about trade-offs, sometimes in projects, a lot of these issues become surprisingly rife with politics and interpersonal issues and whatever, where or one person wants to optimize for performance, and another person thinks, well, we need to get this thing out, or this one person wants to use PHP, and the rest of the team is wanting to use, Java Spring, or, so, I mean, when you're getting into these topics, I mean, there's certainly factual components to consider, but are there any ways that you've found where you can navigate, where there's more than just facts that are gumming up the works in terms of making these trade-offs?
I mean, I see regarding those decisions about technologies, stack, and so on, I see like two patterns. The first one is when the business problems or problems that you are trying to solve are quite easy. And then in that case, people tend to use sophisticated solutions for a challenge, for the sake of challenge. Now, on the other hand, if you have really complex domain or complex problem, like for example, creating database, people tend to use the easiest solutions. Easiest meaning that you are able to reason about everything in the code. So those are two different organizations. I mean, I was working in both domains, and in the second one, when you have really challenging problems, you are not focusing so much on the actual technology, trying to make it easier. Like I was also writing about it in the chapter 9. And it's a very important rule. I think that libraries that you use become your code. And if you tell everyone that, okay, you can use the PHP or something like this, but every library that you will use, you will be owning that. If something will happen to our software, you will be needed to fix that and reason why it stopped working. And in that approach, you are suddenly to maybe thinking that, maybe I will not import the library, or maybe I will just implement some small part of it that is crafted for my use case, instead of importing something big that I don't maybe trust entirely, or maybe doesn't have so great quality, or maybe it's bringing you like megabytes of dependencies that it will impact your build or service or something like this. So that's good rule to start a discussion if someone wants to add a lot of external stuff, right, to the project.
That's interesting because, we've heard for so many years is that phrase, don't reinvent the wheel, which I never liked that phrase because I'm just like, back to human history, how many times have we reinvented the wheel? We're not rolling around on stone wheels. We have reinvented it so many times for so many different use cases. And when I hear people say, well, don't reinvent the wheel, like in C++, there was a project I was working on where the developer that I was mentoring was needing to accomplish a particular task, and he had been asking in the C++ chat room, like, how should I do it? And like, just use end curses. And he's like, I don't want to use end curses because, I mean, sure, it solves the problem, but it's huge. It's another dependency, and it's not a lightweight dependency. And I don't need all of that. I just need that one thing. And he wound up rebuilding and being one of the few people to actually rebuild that one piece because we didn't need everything in end curses. The whole reason we were building is so that we could accomplish a particular task without having to have a dependency like that. But I think that sort of knee-jerk, there's got to be a library out there somewhere. I definitely think that's come back to bite us.
And also there are two perspectives, I think. First is when you are creating a library that will be imported by other projects, other people. In that case, you need to be very careful because they also will be treating you as you are treating other libraries. And other context is that when you are creating some service that's exposing some public APIs and you are encapsulating everything, in that case, it's a lot easier to migrate to something else, some other solution. And in the first one, it may be harder. Sometimes, you need to be careful to not leak also the API or part of the library that you are importing. I mean, I have this chapter 3 about exceptions and handling errors in your code. And it's not only focusing on how to properly propagate this info, what patterns do you have, but also about the problem of treating exceptions as a part of your contract. So sometimes when you are importing a third-party library, and you will propagate exception from the third-party library that you are importing to the caller, then it becomes your contract, right? Suddenly, right? Because the callers of your library will rely on that, and maybe will build a logic around that, and so on. So if you will leak this, then you will be really tight coupled to this first-party library. I mean, there are some tools that allow you to detect that you are leaking some internal details of something that you are using, but it's not easy to capture, and it creates big challenges in the future if you will decide that this library is no longer fit for our use case, or we want to improve it somehow.
I think the move towards software bill of materials has been eye-opening for a lot of developers because, they fire up Cyclone DX or whatever, and they get their software bill of materials that lists all their dependencies and all the dependencies of those dependencies and whatever. I mean, having an SBOM is mandatory for government contracts in the U.S. now. If you're going to develop for the U.S. government, you have to have the software bill of materials. And I imagine it's been eye-opening for a lot of people who think, oh, I just got one dependency, big deal. And then they fire this thing up and they find like 40 libraries. How did that happen? It's like you're mentioning, the libraries that are being brought in by the other libraries being brought in by the other libraries. And then all it takes is one guy maintaining a color library for JavaScript getting more than a bit snarky about something and turning his into malware, and then takes down half the internet.
Yeah, I think the problem with JavaScript and front-end stuff is even more dangerous because, as you mentioned, some security problems and so on. I mean, I'm not an expert in front-end, so I don't have the whole context, but maybe someone that is listening may give some context about front-end and those libraries problems.
I think Bojan can get some context on front-end.
I never did front-end. My siblings do. I'm strictly back-end developer. But I do have questions about high-level technology decisions. I know usually we spoke about dependencies, but a bunch of time we get a business requirement to a specific technology. For example, when there was a hype cycle for MongoDB to be used everywhere because it was web scale. What does that mean? It's web scale. What's web scale? It's web scale. So how do you deal with those hype cycles?
That's a good question. I mean, this, of course, is what I mentioned before, that it will become your cloud, or it will become your own. You will need to own that. So that's the biggest one. But also, like, verifying the technology that you are using, with verifying if what they claim is true. Like, if you give this Mongo example about web scale, so the most important factor there is performance, right? So you can scale it on demand. You will have predictable latency, high throughput, and so on. So this is what they are claiming. But on the other hand, you need to verify what's true, right? So to write performance tests for this solution in your context, so in your context of your specific collection type or database model, do you have some relations between that? Try to model that, and then performance test this solution and see if it's still handling what they were promising to handle. If not, then maybe even if it is, maybe evaluate also a second option and see if they are able to outperform this solution or not. And based on that, you can make some good decisions, not only based on the benchmarks of third party companies or internal to this company. Right?
Yeah. So we talk a lot about bugs, but can you tell me what's the weirdest bug you ever encountered?
Yeah, that's the hard question. I mean, I don't think I have the weirdest one, but I mean something that I remember right now, and it will be regarding working with date time and what you mentioned before. So making components that are initializing date or operating on date without abstracting away it for the testing purpose. Like, for example, if you have this well-maintained libraries like Google Guava, you can inject time and advance the time and test it based on your expectations and everything, right? Without waiting so long in the test, without sleeping and those anti patterns. But on the other hand, encounter some code that had this didn't expose that info outside, so there was some internal date or timestamp creation, and the logic that based on the timestamp was tested in this weird way, like sleeping or waiting for something. That was the first part, right? So, and other part was like relying on defaults. Relying on defaults in this context is relying on defaults system time zone, and it will be a non-deterministic, right? Depending on when you are running that. But also relying on defaults is problematic not only in the context of dates, but also using like third-party code. So, for example, if you are using some HTTP client, I'm covering that in 9th chapter. It's about Caffeinate, or one of the HTTP libraries that are like in the Java ecosystem well known. So they are great, of course, but they are providing some defaults that may be bad for your use case. And I'm speaking particularly about timeouts. So often the HTTP libraries are setting timeouts to really high values, like 10 seconds, or you can measure that even in seconds. But in real production usages, like setting timeouts so high can impact your deployment a lot. Like you can have cascading failures. We will have thread that is occupied for as long as the timeout is without getting the feedback instantaneously. Setting timeouts is one of the most important stuff, I think, in the microservices architecture, for sure. Because even if your service, like assuming that your service is dependent on other, and also other services are calling your service, if you will start having problems, you can cascade this failure to other services. And this failure may start only from that someone didn't set timeouts properly. Relying on defaults. And on the other, so how to do it? Also, I think performance testing, defining SLA and performance testing, that would help you to find out the proper timeouts. Or if you are calling a service that has SLA defined, like for example, the 99 percentile latency will be around 100 milliseconds. Maybe that's the value that you should use, or something like this. And do not rely on defaults. That's bad. Or at least understand the defaults. Maybe defaults are good, but you need to understand them. That was one of the most important and complex tasks in the Java driver, Cassandra Java driver. There was a lot of settings there, and picking the settings properly for general use cases. But on the other hand, there were some specific use cases that required setting those values, timeouts, and pooling, number of threads, and so on, explicitly.
You wrote this book with John Skeet, and some people will recognize that name as being the rather legendary writer of answers on Stack Overflow. How did you end up working with John?
Yeah, so when I had this idea for the book, I've created this proposition for the book with description of the chapters, main ideas, and so on. And I've submitted it to Manning publisher, and the process for them is that they are giving this table of content and this initial draft to top selling authors, like best-selling authors for Manning, like 10 authors or so. And John was one of them. So he was basically reviewing this table of content that I was proposing, and he liked 2 or 3 chapters the most. Like that he would like to also give his input regarding those topics. And the chapters were like, first one was regarding date time, as I mentioned before. And second one is regarding managing versioning and compatibility. So about backward compatibility of your data, but also microservices, APIs, focusing on format like protobuf and so on. So he has experience in that because he was working at Google with protobuf. So also he thought that this chapter there's a great idea for the chapter, and he can give more input on that. And after that we started cooperating. That was the story. So he proposed to be co-author of this book.
Nice.
That was really a pleasure to work with him. Great cooperation. Yeah, he treated me as a co-author, and we discussed a lot. Right? He was reviewing the chapters, my chapters as well. I was reviewing his chapters. Also, I had this initial idea for those chapters, and he tried to be within those boundaries that I thought at the beginning. But of course, I have welcomed all additions from his side. So, for example, the chapter about versioning, my initial idea was to base that on Avro, because I have more experience in Avro and this big data ecosystem, like Spark, Hadoop, and so on. And he has more experience in Protobuf. Yeah, but at the end, we decided that Protobuf is good as well. I mean, this particular technology was not so important, but only the patterns there. So, yeah, that would be it.
So I am noticing that one of the things you discuss in the book is you're talking about requirements and defining requirements for success, basically. Requirements, I imagine, are one of those tough things because usually there's I don't like the term non-technical because you can have people who are capable of being technical from any angle, but really non-developers. You can have non-developers who have to or who want to help define those requirements. How can someone navigate, like, ensuring that those requirements are setting the project up for success when you have to kind of explain some of these concepts to someone who isn't familiar with coding? How do you navigate that?
So you mean more like at the architecture level, or is it more like business, like cooperation between, business teams or owners or something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess any of the above, because it's a lot of times where, you get business requirements that start leaking into some of the technical decisions, and there are set of requirements and trying to get involved in the technical conversations. How do you bring these trade-offs to the table?
I mean, the great pattern for discussing those things is, I think, creating design docs for all your features or your new products. I mean, such a design doc should contain like limitations, the current limitations, the proposed solutions, and ideally you should have n solutions, not one. So try to evaluate a couple of approaches, right, with pros and cons, and list those. Ideally, if you have enough time and resources, you could start some POCs, so proof of concepts for those projects, and gather some insights about all these problems, and also list them in the not so technical way. And the other pattern would be also to not only write, but also graphical representation. I mean, some people are graphical learners, right? So it will make a lot of easier for them to reason about the system, architecture, and so on. So to draw diagrams of like flow between components, business components, also at lower level architecture, and so on. But I mean, if you have a design doc, you can get back to it and treat it as this trade-off book, right? So you could get to it like after a year or so and try to see what was the decision, why it was made, and what outcomes do we have right now.
Well, thanks for coming in and chatting with us, Tomasz. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for the invitation. It was great to talk with you guys.
How was that original Coke, by the way?
It was as usual, good as usual.
Good. They pulled that one out of, I believe, 1920. Don't worry, it's still fresh. Some of those portals don't necessarily go to our present time period.
Hello, Bug Hunters Cafe, just speaking. Certainly. We're open 24/7 at bughunters.cafe, and you can also find us on Twitter at bughunterscafe. Of course, all our music is provided by audionautics.com. We have a link on our website. As a matter of fact, you can win a copy of Software Mistakes and Trade-offs by Tomasz Lelek and John Skips. For your chance to win, just retweet our Twitter post about it and then follow Bug Hunters Cafe for the announcement of the winner in a few weeks. You're welcome. Have a great day.
Aha, this book is about unicorn magic. It looks like it's about playing the trumpet unless you're thinking about the specific information you want to find.
Does that tell you how to use the horn then?
Oh, I didn't say the instructions made sense.